Hi, very exciting time. We're going to transition now into thinking about how to make Mimbres pots. We've got our clay here, and I'm going to demonstrate in this video how to make a flat slab that we can then cut into a circle and to lay it over a few forms. So I'll show you that here. There's a couple of possibilities. When we're done and we have a flat slab circle for our bowl, this is you can use your batt to trim around and get a circle. Then you can lay it over either something like this, which is a wok, if you have one, or you can kind of make your own, which is, this is just a piece of there's a batt on the bottom with lots of newspaper crumpled into balls, and then the tape is used to put it over and over and over again, and as the tape is pulled down to the edge of the round batt, it naturally creates a sort of gently domed space, and you can push down on the high areas and get yourself basically a fine little mold there. So I'll show you each of those as a possibility. And then there's a couple of ways to make a slab. One I'll show you first is to take a piece of clay off, pound it into a bit of a round, and then start just pounding it down. And the pounding method works for a couple of good reasons. One is it's so direct and simple, anybody can do it. But the other thing is it's one of the ways to make the strongest slab. Clay that is pounded down actually does become stronger and stronger. And we will use a couple of other tools here. I need something round to roll over it. This is a metal tube that I had lying around. Here's a wooden dowel that will work. And then here is a piece of PVC pipe. These narrow ones are not as ideal as the broader ones because they can leave indentations and not roll as smoothly. Here's a piece of pipe that would work just fine. So those will all work. And of course, if you have a rolling pin, you can use your kitchen rolling pin and then just wash it off when you're done. So I'm going to get started here. There are a couple of different ways that I said. The one way is to pound it down. Another way is to wedge it. And then after wedging the clay, and I'll show you how that looks, you can also throw and stretch. And so I'll show you that technique as well. So here, I'm gonna aim for about 25% of the clay. I think a bag of clay is 25 pounds. A bowl should be all right. I'm going to try about with a quarter of that. You're looking at 6 to 6.5 pounds of clay. So that's about 25 pounds. I think that should be sufficient. I want to make sure I don't get the bag in there. And I'll just try to pull it as straight across as possible to get a fairly even block of clay. There we go. And remember, when you're working with clay, you always want to immediately cover up any clay that you don't want to dry, because clay is constantly drying. And now I'm just going to use the gravity and the weight of it to just bring it into a round form. And I can do this just by just tapping it around the high point, and I'm compressing it inward. I'm not folding anything over, because when you fold clay, you trap air, and that's one of the rules we go by. We never trap air in our clay. Now I'm rolling it a bit, and that'll make it even more towards a round form here. So I'm getting it round-ish. You can see that's kind of round, and it's a little raised up. It's got some high points, so I can just paddle it down here, and I can keep doing that for a while. Just drop it down and drop it down, and I'm just using gravity. As I do this, I want to be really careful that as I hit it, I'm hitting it parallel to the top surface, to the bottom and the top. Otherwise, it'll get uneven, and we don't want to work any harder than we have to make an even slab. So now, for this method, it is, again, it's kind of a pounding. I can do it this way or this way. I'll start with just my fist and try to overlap my pounding as I go. This is going to make a really strong slab of clay. Got to thin it out and make it really strong as well. And then I can take it and flip it over and continue. You might be thinking, well, Mark, that's awfully bumpy, so bumpy. And you might be saying, hey, that's not very good, that won't work. But what you'll see is that the final move that I make here will make it less bumpy here. So I'm still compressing it. I can even hit it a little bit to try to get it a little longer on these sides, which is narrower. Just a little push forward. And I'm compressing the clay down. And you do notice that I flip it over and over again. And that is going to even out the compression. And now I'm just slapping it. And then I'm going to take it here. And I'm going to use a couple of pieces of wood here. And this is going to help me. These are what I would call rolling guides. And they're just two pieces of old wood that I have lying around. And you may have something of similar. These are about 3/4 of an inch thick, which is thicker than I want it, but they'll do for now. And they just keep me from making it too thin in any one place. So I'm trying this metal tube here. It's not great, but it's working. Let me try the pipe here. And I'll just flip it around so that I can compress both sides equally. And I'm also looking at the round of it to make sure. There we go, we're pretty much even now. They're the same thickness as these. So that makes it sure that by flipping it over and over, I'm treating both sides equally and I'm compressing the clay. And so this is a really strong slab now. And now what I'm going to do, you can see it's a little smaller than I need it to be. So I'm going to stretch it a little bit. This is the stretch technique. Now I could do this with more rolling. And the trick with rolling is if you're going to roll, and now I'm not using the guide, so I have to be super conscientious not to make any unusual indents or roll it off the end, because if I roll it off the end, if I roll it off the end, what happens is it'll get particularly narrow at that point. So I can do that, but the other thing I could do is I could, and you notice that I change directions as I roll. Very important, because that will keep it level and even. Another technique for those of you who want to learn this is imagine a center line right here. And then I'm going to lift it up and stretch it. I'll do this just twice. And that lifting and pulling it, I'm like wiping the surface. I'll pull it across the surface as it comes down, and that will naturally stretch it out. I have to hit the middle though when I do it. I don't want to hit the front end or the back end, because that'll create an uneven slab. It looks like this, very much like pizza. When I grab it, I use very light touch with my finger so it doesn't leave any mark at all, or very little mark. And I'm going to turn now at 90 degrees. So I grab it at 90 degrees, turn it, and do it again. Maybe one more to even out the shape. See if we're getting close now. We are very close here. We just need a little push on one side. And I want to make it a little bigger. There we go. See how that looks. That looks pretty good. Maybe just one more. There we go. So that is our piece. I'm going to grab a needle tool. I've got one. Here's one. So I'm just going to grab our little needle tool here. And I'm going to just very gently cut all the way around. And we can use this spare clay when it's time to make the foot for the piece. You know, we have to carve a foot. And or we have to coil build a foot on there. So we're going to do this. Now I don't worry about these edges. You can see when I take this off here that the edges of the piece aren't exactly that smooth. That's something you address when it gets leather hard. You can gently scrape it down and shape it and make a really nice smooth edge. Now the Mimbres potters did not make they didn't work on the pot so much. They just made a basic open bowl, and there wasn't anything really dramatic about it. They took that open bowl and they used it as basically a canvas for their amazing paintings, which I'm really looking forward to getting into with you. So I'll take this piece here. It's pretty even. It's got a little thinner in some areas, thicker in others, but he can deal with that. And I'm going to get it as centered as I can on this walk here. Just as centered as I possibly can. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to gently push it into form. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And that is the start. Now the only other thing I need is I need a foot right here. So to make it, so I'll show you that in just a moment. But let's try another one of these forms here, another way of making a slab. Set that over there, and we'll take another piece of clay. This is the Dawn 20. You can use Pete's Red. You can use any cone 10 clay. We'll be firing these at cone 5, but the cone 10 will be fine to work with. And this is what always happens to me. Here we go. I lose my cutoff life. So now I'm going to get another quarter of clay. That's my plan. So again, about here, and it turned out to be just about the right amount for that size of a bowl. That worked out just about right. So I'm taking this, it's a little less clay, but hopefully that'll be enough. And I'm going to show you a slightly different approach. Notice again, I'm covering up the clay with covering it with plastic so that it doesn't dry any way I want. The clay is already getting a little dry from all the dry weather here. And then that little cutoff bit that I had, I took and I immediately covered it with plastic right here. So now I'm going to do something a little different, and this is wedging. I'm really not going to be teaching wedging. There are a couple of great videos on already put in on the basics of clay on your, if you look in your class under the clay basics, you'll see wedging described, this style of wedging, I believe. And you can practice that if you wish. Remember, you're not trapping air, you're compressing the clay. You're just compressing the clay to get this kind of what looks like almost a ram's head there. And when it gets a little bit long on the sides, you can turn it up and turn it 90 degrees and start again. And there's another method that I often use, which is a more of a kind of cone method. And it looks like this. So you can look at the wedging. There's many, many videos on how to wedge. I think I've put 2 on your class ceramics basics module. And now this, when I'm doing it, there's this little spiral that occurs right here. So if I want to make sure to prevent any trapped air or cracking, I really just want to compress that down by slamming it down and rolling it a little bit. Now I have already something that's kind of round. So what I'm going to do now is a little bit more of a throwing approach than last time you saw me use the rolling pins, and I'll use them a little bit towards the end. But for now, I'm just going to use the slam down and throw method here. And so to start with, I'm just smashing it straight down. But I can't get a satisfactory even slab this way. I have to do that technique where I see that line there. Can you see that line is really right through the middle? And I'm going to throw it, pull it towards myself, and just wipe the table with it so it just stretches out. Grab it again 90 degrees and pull it. Each time I'm turning it 90 degrees and I'm flipping it over, so it's a very even effect. This still isn't as strong as the slab you saw me make the first time, and that is because the slab I made the first time I did by smashing down, and this one is done by stretching, 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 so it's a very different kind of method. The smashing down really compresses the clay molecules and makes it very strong. Now I'm going to shift to the rolling method just because this will help me see it's almost identical. It's right to the board. This side is almost a little low. This one was just a touch high. It's almost exactly at the board. So that was just to check and make sure that I'm staying fairly even. And now I'm just going to stretch it to get to the size I need for my bowl. And I don't want to go too big because I'd like them to be a little bit thick. I don't want them to be too thin. I want them to be sturdy. And so I want to stop right when I get to cuttable, when I get to the size that the disc fits easily within. Take that disc off, take these little pieces out here. Now, you don't have to use a paper form, you don't have to use a wok. You may have something else that works better for you. I'll give you an example of another alternative here. You can probably think of some on your own. Some artists even make plaster molds of this hump shape in order to do it. So I'm going to use the paper one now and just place it gently over the top and kind of before I press down at all. And I want to just gently press down because the paper doesn't have as solid a form as it's more malleable. So I'm going to have to I'm really shaping to make sure that I'm getting the form that I want. And I don't want to push on down too hard anywhere because I would start picking up the imprint of the newspaper, which is not something I want. So there's another one. These are both fine bowls here. You can also throw them, if you have a wheel and you're comfortable throwing, you can throw them at home, and I will be happy to show you how that's done. Let me show you one more possible form here to use. This is a little gentler curve, and it's the stuff I have lying around. This is a disc from a farm implement that's used, whoa, watch out, used to till the field. You get all these great spontaneous moments in this. It has a little texture on it that would show up in the piece there. So I don't know if I would probably clean that off before I used it. Because sometimes I like this texture in slabs, but for this, I want a smooth painting surface. And anytime you put texture in, you lose that painted surface. So that gives you a sense. You can also use this kind of idea. And I would just take a steel brush and clean it up. So now, let me show you how I would go about putting a foot on this. You've seen it's basically the same thing we did for the African pot. And when it comes to the, I'm just going to set that down a little bit, change the shape, put that there. When it comes to the newspaper form, I have to wait a little bit because if I push down to attach if I'm going to attach to it this foot, I'll really misshape it because it's such a soft form, but the wok is very solid, so I can go ahead and do that right now. And what this is all about here is I've raised it up so that it sits in the wok comfortably. Otherwise, the wok would touch the ground. But now this keeps it spinnable. Put it on that little lazy Susan idea there. And I'm just going to put my finger here to see, whoops, I guess it does slide around a bit, just gently to see how it's pretty centered. So that's good. It's a little wiggly, but then I'm going to take a scoring tool. Okay, so now got a little slip here for when the time comes. And so I've got some dry clay in water here, and that will make a nice slip to play with. Let that settle in a little bit. And then I'm going to just get a little scoring tool. You can use, as I've said before, you can use a fork. And again, I'm not going to worry about this edge here. I don't want a sharp edge here. I want a soft kind of rounded edge. I'll do that later, and I'll show you in a related video here. So I'm just holding my hand steady and carefully spinning this around. And maybe it won't be exactly in the center. Be pretty close. I can eyeball it. I can see that it's a little bit more over there. So I'm going to try bring this around here a little bit. There we go. That feels a little bit better there. So I'm just going to call that fairly centered. That's a pretty decent sized foot there. And the foot is going to do two things. Of course, it's going to stabilize the bowl. And these Mimbres bowls were used quite a bit in the culture. They were used for food and everyday purposes, serving food, eating food, but as well as for funerary objects. Much like the African pottery, sometimes when someone passed away, their water pot that they used day after day to carry water from the well or from the stream, that pot was buried with them, and it was considered to contain their spirit. And so we know that the Mimbres pots were almost all entirely found in graveyards, and you'll find in graves, in burial sites, and you'll find a great article that I just put up from the University of Minnesota, from the Weissman Museum, where they're questioning the current, how ethics have grown and changed. So whether they should really have these artifacts that are so much part of somebody's culture. It is kind of strange when you see a Mimbres bowl that has a hole in it. That bowl was buried on top of somebody. Somebody was buried. They were buried in seated positions, upright and seated positions, and the bowl was put on top of their head. So that's what you're looking at, is somebody's kind of grave object. So could you imagine going into a museum and seeing your grandmother or grandfather's gravestone on display with an explanation of what an interesting culture it was? So there is that question that people are asking. So there's a nice article for you in your module. So now I'm going to take this clay that I cut off the sides of the slabs that I made. And I'm just going to do what we know how to do. I'm going to compress it really well because it's got all these little pieces. And then I'm going to roll it to get a nice even coil. And you remember from my earlier talks about coil building, what makes a coil nice and even isn't how hard and careful you push with your hands. It's getting a little pressure on it, kind of general pressure, and then using the surface of the flat surface of the table to actually do the smoothing work for you. So now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to start the coil building process and just work it right in to the scored area. It looks like I'll need the other clay as well. And what I would also say is that with your foot, you have a couple of choices. Do you want the possibility of hanging this piece eventually on the wall like a painting, or are you going to keep it as a serving bowl? If you've got a serving bowl in mind, then there's really no other consideration than creating a decent foot. But if you want to hang it like a painting, then what you need to do is either put a couple of holes in it so you can string a wire, or I can make the foot flare out a little bit so that I can wrap a wire around the base of the foot and hang it that way, as with a circle of wire to hold it. So now I'm going to go around the outside and really make sure that coil is pushed down. Really want to get a nice join into that well slipped area. And you can see again, my thumb is overlapping the previous push. So I'm always overlapping my thumb, and that gives me a much more even surface, and I've made it all the way around now. And then I'm going to do the next step here, which I'll show you. The next step is to take your rubber rib, and you've got either a blue or a black one. I've got here a green one. These are wonderful ribs that are available from Mud Tools, mudtools.com, and it works for me. That's what I have on hand here. So I'm just gonna even that out a bit. And as I'm doing this, what I'm really thinking is that I'm creating, this is really all that goes into making a canvas. We're really, in this project, we're more painters than anything else. Remember, this is the second step of coiling, which is the wiping. And there we go. I think I'm going to see about making it, I could make it just a little bit taller, maybe a little thicker. So what I'm going to do is just get another coil of clay here. So as it gets a little taller, I may use a paddle to finish it. But let's just take this here. And this is a little bit of the clay again that was cut off the circle. And I'll take this coil, bring the pot back in, and now I don't need to score and slip because it's all soft clay and I've already scored and slipped to join it. And the reason I want to score and slip it, even though all the clay is soft, is that the clay that is the bottom of the pot, that is the bowl shape, is really going this direction. And now I'm starting the clay going this direction for this coil building. And it may, as it dries, want to pull away or crack. So I'm trying to prevent that as much as possible by scoring and slipping my initial attachment. Another good way to prevent cracking is to, another good way, I know the answer to this. Another good way to prevent cracking is once I get this done, I'm going to cover it with plastic and let it dry slow. The slower you dry things, the less chance there is of it cracking. And where it wants to crack is right here. These edges will dry first because they're most exposed to the air if I don't cover it. And they'll dry first, and then they'll shrink. That's what happens when clay dries, it shrinks. And so it'll shrink and it'll become very stiff. And then the middle of the pot, which is not dry yet, begins to dry. And it will want to pull on the edges, and it'll pull on the edges, and the edges are stiff, and so they can crack. So we're going to try to prevent that. If your piece does crack, you just crumble it up, throw it in a bag with some water, and start again. Sometimes it takes a few efforts to get it right. So that's just that's how we work. That's our field. And I won't flip this over to show it to you. The other thing I want to pay attention to, not so much for the newspaper, because the newspaper's soft and compressible, and it's also a narrower curve. This might be, it should be all right, but it has to shrink. And if it pulls in this way, it'll crack. If it shrinks up along it, it won't crack. So it's a question as to how it's going to handle that. So I'm going to see about finishing this up a little bit, and then I'll get a paddle. And I'll trim it even. So here's wiping the inside. And so that's a nice job wiping inside. If I want to, I could flare this out a little bit, or I can put 2 holes in here for hanging, and that's probably what I'll do. I like the flaring method though for one big reason, which is that way you can hang it in any direction. So. Here's my wonderful paddle, and look what else I found when I was over there. That would have been helpful, but anyway. Now what I'm going to do is just the paddle initially is to compress it, and that makes for a stronger joint, and also gives you a nice even foot if you go in different directions. That'll make it kind of even. And I'm looking around and seeing how that looks there. And I think what I'm going to do is just do a little indent here to start with. And so I want to go around and I'll eyeball it. First I'm going to just, here's that little indent, and I can wrap a wire tightly around this, and that will be a place for me to hang the bowl if I decide. If I do a good enough job that I want to look at it hanging on the wall, then that will give me an area to wrap a wire and hang it. So it's a little undercut there. And then here, I can even emphasize that a little bit more by swelling this out a little bit. And then I do want to take a little bit of time to smooth, to make an even circle around the outside to start with. I want it to look fairly even as a circle. And you can see it's a little irregular because of the thickness of the coil and my paddling. So you can also ensure a flat surface by taking this and gently paddling it down. But now I really do want to make sure that I have a kind of evenness here. And so where it's a little bit thick, I'll just trim it. And this takes some time and care, but you can already see it's starting to look more uniform, and that's what you want. You want it to have a look like, you know, it's very even and uniform and competently made, shall we say. There we go. Guess I could try to do it this way so you can see what's happening here. And I can also finish that evening out here. Where it's a little bit thin, I can take some of this clay and build it up a little bit, make it a little bit thicker. So I can fill in as much as, I can add and subtract to create an even looking foot. And you can see we're making some great progress here. And that's pretty much the first part. And you may want to make 2 or 3 of these, depending on how, so that you don't feel pressured that your first painting has to be great. You can you know, kind of develop, kind of think of them as pages in a sketchbook, so you can build enough to practice with. And so that's starting to look better and better there. Take a little bit more of this and just build that up there. So this would be about where I'd be asking people for questions. If you do have any questions with what you're seeing, please feel free to write me in, write me a email. Many of you have been writing emails, and I really appreciate that. It makes me glad to be in contact with you. And so that's a good thing. And I'm just going to, I could do this for quite some time, and you don't need to watch all of that. Again, I'll do one more tap to get a good final flatness across the bottom because you don't want it to wobble. And that looks pretty good. And I will scrape it down and clean it up after it's dry. There's one more thing I want you to see. Remember that you always, always, always sign your work very clearly so we know that it's yours. Here's a dull pencil, one of my favorite signing tools. And it's very simple, just a little M and a slash for L. And I've signed it. So there is the piece. And that's one way to go about making Mimbres pottery, the big open bowl.